Karen stormed into my driveway waving a lawsuit, screaming that I couldn't live so close to her HOA. What she didn't know, I was a retired landlawyer, and 3 minutes later, her precious HOA legally ceased to exist. Asterisk, the first time I ever saw Karen, she was walking briskly across the field that separated her property from mine, arms pumping like she was leading a marching band, and holding a thick blue binder clutched tightly against her chest. I was standing on my gravel driveway at the time, fixing the tailgate on my old Ford pickup. The sun was hot. I'd been out there for about an hour, wrench in one hand, sweat dripping into my eyes, minding my business. I saw her coming from the corner of my eye and immediately got that feeling you get when you realize someone's about to come lecture you about something you didn't ask for. "Excuse me," she called out before she was even halfway across the grass. "Are you the property owner here?" I wiped my hands on a rag and turned to face her. She had short, curled blonde hair, sunglasses too big for her face, and a name badge clipped to her shirt that said Cedar Hills Lakeside HOA President. Even before she introduced herself, I knew exactly what I was dealing with. I'd lived near an HOA before. You could spot the HOA types from a mile away. They all had the same tone, like they were about to hand you a parking ticket. I said calmly. She looked me up and down like I was a broken swing set in a brand new park. "Well, I'm Karen Delaney, president of the HOA over in Cedar Hills Lakeside. We've been reviewing the area, and we noticed a few things over here that don't quite match the community standards." I blinked at her. "I don't live in your community." She smiled tightly, then opened her binder and flipped a page. "Technically, you're within visible proximity of the HOA jurisdiction. Our board has been discussing properties like yours, and we've found that visual non-compliance, things like unapproved mailbox colors, unregistered RVs, or even non-standard fence materials can negatively affect property values within our HOA. We're preparing a vote to expand the boundary to include your parcel." I actually laughed. "You're planning to vote me into an HOA I never joined, on land I legally own, and where your rules have never applied? It's more of an administrative correction," she said, tone clipped. "It's for everyone's benefit. Property values are delicate." "Lady," I said, walking back toward my tailgate, "I bought this place because it wasn't in an HOA. That's not going to change." Karen's mouth flattened into a thin line. "We'll see," she said, flipping a binder shut. "There are legal channels." That was the first of many visits. Over the next 2 weeks, Karen made her presence known like a cold sore on picture day. She'd show up uninvited, walking the boundary line of my fence like a prison guard on patrol. Once, she even took pictures of my shed. I watched from the porch, sipping coffee and marveling at the nerve. She'd scribble notes in her binder, huff, and march back across the field like she owned the land under her feet. It was annoying, but I didn't think she'd take it further than that. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Wednesday afternoon by certified mail. The envelope had all the markings of something trying way too hard to be official. When I opened it, I found a neatly typed complaint from Cedar Hills Lakeside HOA, claiming I was in violation of their bylaws, everything from the height of my grass to the presence of my RV in the driveway. They were demanding backdated dues for the past 3 years, totaling nearly $9,000, plus fines. They also threatened legal action if I didn't comply within 30 days. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh until I read the last page, which stated that the HOA had already filed a petition in the county court to forcibly annex my property into their boundaries due to community impact necessity. That's when the blood rushed to my ears. I sat down at my kitchen table and read the whole thing twice. Then I opened the file cabinet next to the fridge where I kept my land deed, title history, survey maps, and most importantly my legal certifications. You see, what Karen didn't know was that I wasn't just some guy living off the grid. I was a retired land use attorney with over 3 decades of experience in property law, zoning disputes, and you guessed it, HOA litigation. If Karen had taken 10 minutes to run a background check or even Google my name, she would have realized she was barking up a very dangerous legal tree. Instead, she tried to flex her binder at the wrong man, and now I was going to bury her in paperwork. The first thing I did was pull the original HOA charter from the county records. Cedar Hills Lakeside had been formed in the mid-90s, originally with 26 properties. Over time they expanded to 40, but my parcel was never part of the recorded boundaries, not once. In fact, a boundary survey done in 2001 explicitly excluded my lot due to the original owner opting out when the community formed. That made the HOA's claim to my land completely baseless. But it got better. I kept digging. Turns out, 3 years ago, the HOA tried to update their charter to include potential annexation zones but failed to follow the correct filing process with the county recorder's office. The vote had passed within their own meetings, but the updated charter had never been properly submitted, stamped, or registered. Legally, it didn't exist. That meant not only was their claim against me invalid, but their entire governance might be operating without a valid legal foundation. I poured myself a bourbon and smiled. Over the next few days, I compiled a legal brief that outlined every single procedural error the HOA had committed: missing public notices, failure to obtain unanimous consent for annexation, improper fee schedules, and the kicker, the invalid charter. I attached certified maps, surveyor affidavits, and my property's clean deed chain. Then I filed my own motion, not just to block their petition, but to request a full county review of the HOA's legal standing. The court date was set for the following Friday. Karen must have caught wind of what was happening, because that Thursday afternoon she came stomping back across my field again. She didn't bother with pleasantries this time. Her voice was raised before she even reached my porch. "You had no right to go behind our back," she snapped. "You're trying to sabotage everything we've built. You don't care about community, just yourself." I stood up slowly, walked to the porch railing, and looked her straight in the eyes. "You came after me with threats, fake fines, and a lawsuit based on lies. I'm just defending my home. You want to talk community? Try being a neighbor first. You'll regret this," she hissed, turning on her heel. I watched her retreat again across the field, back into her HOA kingdom. But something in her gait had changed. There was no bounce in her step anymore. She didn't walk like a general. She walked like someone who'd just realized she'd marched into a war she couldn't win the next day. We walked into the county hearing room. Karen wore a stiff blue blazer and walked in with 2 board members, still carrying her binder like it was a holy book. I walked in with 2 folders and a calm smile. The hearing took less than 20 minutes. I laid out every legal error, every broken step, every unfiled amendment. I showed the judge where the charter had expired and never been renewed. Karen tried to interrupt twice, but each time she was told to let me finish. When I was done, the judge turned to Karen and asked if she had any legal proof that my land was ever included in the HOA. She opened her binder, flipped through page after page, and came up empty. 3 minutes later, the judge signed the order. The Cedar Hills Lakeside HOA charter was legally invalid and therefore dissolved. Karen sat frozen in her chair as the room emptied around her. I walked by slowly, leaned in, and said quietly, "Next time you want to swing a sword, make sure it isn't made of paper." And just like that, her empire was gone. Karen's letter had been the first shot fired. But it wasn't just some angry neighbor note. It was an official HOA document, complete with a fake notice of violation stapled to a list of infractions that made less sense the longer I looked at them. She accused me of non-regulation fencing, prohibited vehicle storage, unsightly paint colors, and failure to submit community architectural approvals. Mind you, I had never signed, joined, or even been near a meeting of her HOA, and yet, here it was, a demand for back dues, penalties, and a threat to sue. I sat back in my chair at the kitchen table, the stack of papers spread out in front of me like a bad joke. The number at the bottom was nearly $9,300, money they claimed I owed them just for existing near their subdivision. I was supposed to pay for not being in their neighborhood. What infuriated me wasn't the amount. I could have paid it if I wanted to. What got me was the arrogance, the sheer, unbelievable gall of someone thinking they could extend their authority like that just because they thought they could. And unfortunately for Karen, she had picked the wrong person to try and intimidate. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was stressed, but because my legal instincts kicked in like muscle memory. I dug through my records, land deed, title insurance, plat maps, county zoning files, everything I'd reviewed before buying the property. It was all there, just as I remembered. This land was never part of Cedar Hills Lakeside. Not historically, not technically, not in spirit, and certainly not legally. The next morning, just after sunrise, I stepped outside with my coffee and looked down toward Karen Street. Her house was already buzzing with life, or more accurately, with HOA drama. 3 people stood at the bottom of her driveway, waving their hands, holding clipboards, talking fast. Karen was in the middle, pointing in my direction. I didn't need to hear the words to know exactly what was being said. Over the next few days, Karen escalated. She left printed notices taped to the edge of my mailbox post. She walked by my property with a camera, taking pictures of my shed, my deck, even the grill I kept by the porch. Once, I watched her crouch behind my fence and take a photo through a crack in the slats. She was building a file. The question was, why? Then, I got the answer. On a Friday morning, a courier knocked on my door with a sealed envelope, not a neighborhood note this time, but a court-stamped petition for annexation and compliance. The HOA was trying to force my property into their control through the county court. In their complaint, they claimed that the aesthetic condition of my home and non-conforming fixtures were negatively impacting HOA property values, and that the board had voted to absorb my lot into their jurisdiction. They even accused me of knowingly defying community standards. I couldn't help but laugh when I read that line. What Karen didn't know, what she never bothered to check, was that she'd walked headfirst into a legal buzzsaw. This wasn't just my home. This was a fortress of law and property rights. And I had spent decades fighting cases just like this. I started digging not just into my own documents but into the HOAs as well, thanks to the Open Records Act, and some contacts I still had at the county recorder's office. I got access to Cedar Hills Lakeside HOA's full charter history. The more I read, the more it became clear. This wasn't just a case of overreach. This was full-blown incompetence. Their original charter, drafted in 1995, included 26 parcels clearly defined, all within a square grid near the artificial lake they'd built. My parcel, on the other hand, was part of an older agricultural zone that had never been developed as part of their community. Then, in 2001, there had been an attempt to expand the HOA boundaries, but only 7 of the 26 homeowners voted in favor, not enough to meet the 2/3 requirement. The county rejected the amendment, and the issue had been quietly dropped. But somewhere along the way, around 2019, from what I could tell, the HOA board decided to start operating as if that boundary expansion had passed. They began listing adjacent properties as provisional HOA members, including several lots that were legally never included. They even began billing them. Most ignored the letters. A few paid out of fear, and apparently, no one ever challenged them. Until now. One night I opened my laptop and started drafting. It felt like being back in the courtroom again. I wrote a counter-motion that included 6 full exhibits: certified maps, surveyors, declarations, boundary certifications, and copies of the HOA's failed expansion attempts. I pointed out their procedural violations, their unlawful claims of jurisdiction, and their unauthorized attempt to use county court to strong-arm property owners into submission. Then I did something extra. I included a formal request for review of organizational standing with the county clerk's office, a rarely used but powerful legal move. It basically asked the court to verify whether the HOA even had the legal status to file their petition in the first place. That part was the trap, because in their rush to bully people, Cedar Hills Lakeside HOA had failed to file an updated charter for more than 5 years, and under the county's rules, that meant their status as a legal entity had expired quietly, without them even knowing it. The morning of the hearing came fast. Karen showed up at the county courthouse wearing a navy blue pantsuit, heels clicking across the floor, binder clutched like it contained the 10 Commandments. She had 2 board members with her, both older men, both looking like they were used to getting their way. I walked in wearing jeans, boots, and a button-down shirt. No tie, no suit. I wasn't there to impress. I was there to win. When the judge called the case, Karen stood tall and proud, delivering a dramatic opening statement about community values and maintaining neighborhood harmony. She tried to paint me as the outsider, the troublemaker, the lone rebel causing disorder. Then she passed her binder up to the bench, as if its pages would seal my fate. The judge flipped through it, frowning slightly. Then he turned to me. "Mr. Taylor," he said, "you filed a response." "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, standing slowly. "And a request for review of standing." I handed over my folders, neat, tabbed, and thorough. As the judge began reviewing them, I saw Karen glance toward me, her smile flickering just a little. "Mr. Taylor," the judge said after several minutes, "this documentation indicates the HOA's charter expired due to lack of updated filings. Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir," I said. "Their last registered update was in 2017. Under County Regulation 11B, Section 3, that lapse voids legal entity status." The room fell silent. Karen's face turned pale. The judge sighed. "In that case, the HOA currently lacks standing to pursue this claim. I'm dismissing the petition with prejudice. Furthermore, I am forwarding this issue to the clerk's office for review. If the HOA is operating without proper legal standing, that's a matter for the county." Just like that, it was over. 3 minutes. That's all it took. I packed up my folders, gave Karen one last glance, and walked out of that courtroom into the sunlight, knowing that her game was up. What she had tried to build on fear and paperwork had crumbled under the weight of real law. By the time I got home that afternoon, the neighborhood grapevine was already buzzing. People who'd once kept their heads down under HOA pressure started calling me and came over just to say thank you. Others brought pie. I hadn't realized how many people had been quietly suffering under Karen's self-appointed rule, and though she didn't know it yet, the worst for her was still to come. The courthouse may have gone quiet after the judge dropped the gavel, but the neighborhood erupted like a thunderstorm. By that same evening, the news had made it to every porch and patio in Cedar Hills Lakeside and beyond. The HOA was dead, dissolved, powerless. 3 minutes of truth had shattered years of bullying. Karen's reign had ended, and suddenly, everyone who had ever been pushed around by her found their voice again. I got my first thank you note on my doorstep the next morning. It was handwritten in blue ink on lined paper. No signature, just a simple message that read, "Thank you for standing up when no one else could." Taped to it was a gift card for the local diner. I didn't take it for the reward. I took it for what it meant. Someone had felt powerless, and now they DN'd single quotes 2. By noon, I'd received 3 more letters. One woman even knocked on my door with tears in her eyes. "We were paying over $350 a month for nothing," she said, "and every time I tried to complain, they threatened to fine us more." She was in her 60s and had lived in Cedar Hills for over a decade. Karen had sent her notices for unauthorized seasonal decorations and even fined her because her grandkids left bikes in the driveway. It felt like prison, she whispered, but now it feels like home again. I listened patiently, nodded, and offered her a seat. But deep down, I was angry. Not for myself, I'd never been under Karen's thumb, but for the people who were. The HOA wasn't supposed to be a tool for control. In the right hands, it was meant to help a community maintain roads, support security, keep shed spaces clean, but Karen had turned it into a personal fiefdom. The next day, Karen held what she called a community emergency gathering. It was supposed to be in the HOA clubhouse, but the county had locked it due to the ongoing investigation into the HOA's expired status. So she moved it to her driveway, folding chairs, a portable speaker, and the same old blue binder in her hands. Maybe 20 people showed up. Most were board members or neighbors who either hadn't heard the full story or were still loyal to her. I stood a little way off, arms crossed, watching from a distance. She looked shaken but still tried to fake authority. Her voice trembled as she read off a prepared statement about irregular legal decisions and temporary setbacks and how the HOA could be revived through unity. But the crowd wasn't buying it. Someone shouted, "Did you even have the authority to fine us?" Another asked, "Where did all our dues go?" Karen didn't answer. Someone else yelled, "Why did you send a lawsuit to the guy who doesn't even live here?" At that point her hands were visibly shaking. She closed the binder mid-sentence, muttered something about seeking legal counsel, and walked away from the makeshift podium. People began leaving almost immediately. Some looked embarrassed they had ever followed her lead. Others looked relieved, like a weight had been lifted. Karen stood alone by her garage door, shoulders hunched, face pale. It would have been easy to gloat, but I didn't. I just walked home. But Karen wasn't done. 2 days later, a man in a gray suit knocked on my door and handed me another letter. This one was from Karen's personal attorney, not the HOA, because, legally, it no longer existed. The letter accused me of interfering with a neighborhood organization and causing reputational damage. They were threatening to sue me personally for defamation and malicious interference. I sat down at my desk and read it 3 times. It was laughable. No court in the state would take that claim seriously, but that wasn't the point. Karen was trying to rattle me. She was grasping at the last scraps of control she had left. It wasn't about justice. It was about revenge. I drafted a response myself. 2 pages, cold and professional. I listed the exact laws she had violated, the civil penalties she could face for unauthorized legal action under a defunct entity, and noted that any further attempts to harass me would be met with counterclaims and motions for dismissal with prejudice. I sent it to her attorney and CC'd the county legal office. I didn't hear back, but the fallout didn't stop there. Over the next week, the county began auditing the HOA's financial records. Since their charter had lapsed years ago, they had no legal authority to collect or spend member dues. Every dollar they took since the expiration was now subject to investigation. Where did it go? Who approved the expenses? What about the private maintenance contracts Karen signed on behalf of the HOA? Suddenly, people weren't just angry, they were asking questions. A few residents banded together and contacted a civil attorney. A class action lawsuit began to take shape. Neighbors who had been fined, billed, or threatened during the HOA's illegal operations wanted their money back. One man had been charged $4,000 over 2 years for parking violations because he kept his work truck in the driveway. Another had been ordered to repaint his entire home twice because the shade of beige didn't match the community palette. By the end of the month, Karen's reputation was shredded. Her for sale sign went up just after the 4th of July. No open house, no farewell party. Just a quiet exit. A few neighbors said they saw her loading boxes into a U-Haul. In the early morning, head down, binder nowhere in sight. The woman who once marched through the neighborhood issuing orders now slipped away in silence. Cedar Hills Lakeside, for the first time in years, felt like an actual neighborhood again. People painted their fences whatever color they wanted. Lawns were trimmed with a little more personality. Kids played on the sidewalk without fear of complaints. A group of retirees organized a weekend picnic without having to submit an event permit like they had to under Karen's rule. And every now and then, someone would pass me by, raise a hand, and say, "Thanks again, Taylor." I didn't need recognition. I didn't want it, but I understood why it mattered. Standing up to Karen wasn't just about beating a bad rule book. It was about reminding people that power only works when we let it, that silence lets bullies grow, but courage makes them shrink, and that sometimes all it takes to end a little tyranny is one person saying, "No more." It wasn't just her HOA I had dissolved. It was her illusion of control. I still sit on my porch every morning, same coffee mug, same old dog lying at my feet. The RV is still parked in the driveway, just because it can be. The shed is still bright red. The flag waves high above the porch. No more fake notices, no more blue binders, just the breeze. The birds and peace, real, earned peace. After Karen's quiet exit, Cedar Hills Lakeside felt like a different place. Neighbors began waving more often, kids laughed louder in the yards, and people actually talked to one another. What had once felt like a neighborhood under watch suddenly felt like a community again. But just when everyone thought the worst was over, the county stepped in, and what followed would make Karen's antics look like amateur hour. It started with a letter, not one sent to me, but to the entire neighborhood. The county had opened a formal audit into the now-defunct HOA, and every resident who had paid dues or received fines in the past 5 years was invited, or rather required, to participate. According to the letter, the HOA's failure to maintain legal status for several years meant any financial activity it engaged in during that period could be considered unauthorized collection of funds. In plainer terms, they wanted to know where the money went and if any crimes had been committed. The letter caused a stir. Some residents were eager to help, finally feeling like the tables had turned. Others were nervous. A few had served as board members under Karen and were now worried they might be on the hook for decisions they'd blindly signed off on. A town hall was scheduled at the community center, this time led not by a self-appointed president, but by a representative from the county auditor's office and a clerk from the civil investigations unit. I didn't intend to go. I'd made my point, I'd won my case. But curiosity and a few phone calls from nervous neighbors pulled me in. The place was packed, rows of folding chairs, people standing in the back, whispers flying like bees in a hive. At the front stood a tall man in a gray blazer and glasses, introducing himself as Mr. Lane from the county. Beside him was a woman named Marissa, the assigned financial investigator. They didn't come with small talk. They came with facts. According to their preliminary findings, the HOA had collected over $680,000 in dues and fines over a span of 5 years, all while technically unregistered and unrecognized by the county as a legal entity. That meant no lawful bank account filings, no authorized disbursement records, and no transparency on where the money had gone. They laid out what they had already uncovered: undocumented vendor payments, suspicious landscaping charges, a $12,000 expense labeled neighborhood beautification with no receipts, and several payments routed through what looked like a personal account under Karen's name. A low, collective gasp rippled through the room. Someone in the back muttered, "Oh my God." Marissa flipped to the next slide, a chart showing annual dues versus spending. 1 year showed more spent than collected, an overage of $26,000. Another showed a sudden dip in community maintenance expenses but a spike in consulting fees. None of it had been approved by residents. Most of them hadn't even known those numbers existed. The room turned from shocked to furious. A man stood up, red in the face. "I asked to see the financials 2 years ago and Karen said they were confidential. She'll fine me $300 for questioning her." Others chimed in. Stories poured out. A young couple said they'd been told they couldn't build a swing set for their daughter because it violated a safety clause. Another woman said Karen had sent her 2 warnings for non-conforming flower arrangements. Then came the kicker. Mr. Lane explained that the county had discovered 3 contracts issued under the HOA name that were never filed with the county or reviewed by a licensed accountant. 2 of those contracts were awarded to companies registered under Karen's cousin's name. The third was tied to a dissolved LLC in another state, one that hadn't existed since 2016 at that point. People weren't just mad, they were livid. What had once been whispers about overreach and control now looked a lot more like fraud. When the floor opened for questions, someone turned to me. "Taylor, you're the one who blew the lid off this. What happens now?" I stood slowly. I hadn't planned to speak, but there it was. "Now," I said, "you hold people accountable." Karen operated behind a wall of fake authority and silence. She counted on people being too afraid or too confused to fight back, but the law doesn't work that way. You don't get to make up rules and take people's money just because you have a title on a clipboard. I looked directly at Mr. Lane. If funds were misused, people need to get that money back. He nodded. "That's exactly what this investigation is for." A few people clapped. Others looked stunned, but the mood had shifted again. What started as fear had turned into fire. The audit continued for several weeks. Karen was officially subpoenaed for documents, but from what I heard, she was no longer cooperating. She had hired a defense attorney and was now claiming she had acted in good faith and believed the HOA was legally active the entire time. Her former board members, those who didn't lawyer up, began distancing themselves fast, saying Karen made all the decisions and that they had simply followed her lead, one by one. The stories unfolded. Turns out Karen had bought herself a new golf cart last summer, a fancy custom-painted one. She told neighbors it was for community patrol. Turns out, the receipt showed it was paid for using the HOA's card. People remembered seeing her grandkids riding around in it at a 4th of July event. Then there was the landscaping company she hired, billed at triple the normal rate, with no visible difference in the neighborhood. A resident who worked in contracting said they never once saw any work being done beyond Karen's own block. It all added up. Eventually, the county filed a civil claim against her for restitution and fraud. While criminal charges weren't yet confirmed, the evidence kept growing. People began whispering the word embezzlement. Karen's property was flagged with a lien pending the investigation. If she tried to sell it now, she'd have to pay back whatever the county demanded first. I watched it unfold from a distance. I'd done my part, but now the system was doing the rest. Every lie, every threat, every power trip from that woman was now being unspooled in court documents and county records, and the neighborhood, it bloomed. For the first time in years, people mowed their lawns how they liked, painted their shutters any color they pleased, and held block parties without permission slips. Someone put up a hammock in their front yard. A teenager started offering lawn care services, something Karen had banned as unlicensed commerce. People weren't just free. They were alive again. One afternoon, a man named Joe stopped by. I'd seen him around, ex-military, retired mechanic, kept to himself. "Just wanted to shake your hand," he said. "I've lived here 12 years. I thought I was the only one who hated what it had become." "You weren't," I replied. He nodded. "But you were the first one who did something." The morning of the court hearing was calm. To calm. The kind of stillness that creeps up before a summer thunderstorm tears the sky apart. I arrived 30 minutes early, dressed in a plain navy suit, clutching a leather folder that held the one thing Karen hadn't expected, the legal blueprint to dismantle her little empire. Karen, on the other hand, strolled into the courthouse like she was walking a red carpet. Two of her HOA board members followed close behind, dressed like knockoff politicians. She saw me, smirked, and gave me a slow, sarcastic wave. Her confidence was almost laughable, built on paper-thin assumptions and a belief that no one would ever fight back. She had no clue what was about to hit her. Inside the courtroom, the judge called a session to order. Karen's attorney, a man named Ruckner who looked like he'd skipped through every ethics class in law school, stood up first. He began with exaggerated dramatics, painting Karen as a community savior trying to keep unregulated neighbors from destroying their serene neighborhood. According to him, I was a dangerous threat to property values, neighborhood aesthetics, and suburban harmony. When my turn came, I stood slowly and opened my folder, laying out each of Karen's mistakes one by one. "Your Honor," I began, "not only is my property outside the jurisdiction of Cedar Hills Lakeside HOA, but Mrs. Karen Hendricks knowingly filed a frivolous lawsuit designed to harass and intimidate a private citizen." The judge's eyebrows rose. I continued, "And I'd like to submit into evidence this map, registered in the county land records, showing the clear boundary line. My home is 300 feet outside the HOA's reach." The judge nodded. Karen leaned over to her lawyer, whispering frantically. "But I didn't stop there," I said, locking eyes with the judge. "I also uncovered multiple violations within the HOA's operating procedures: improper voting records, budget discrepancies, undocumented board meetings, and most significantly an expired charter that was never renewed under the state HOA compliance law." That last part silenced the courtroom. Even Ruckner looked like he'd swallowed a fly. Karen's voice echoed from behind the table. "That's not true. That's not even possible." The judge tapped his gavel. "Ms. Hendricks, you'll have your turn," I went on, detailing how the HOA's legal standing had quietly dissolved 18 months ago without renewal. It meant they had been operating illegally, enforcing fines, and collecting dues with no actual authority. And once I had the evidence, I did what any experienced lawyer would. I submitted a petition to the county registrar to legally and permanently dissolve the HOA before Karen ever even served me her lawsuit. Karen stood up suddenly, her voice sharp. "You can't dissolve the HOA. Who gave you that right?" The judge turned to her calmly. "He didn't need your permission. According to the law, any qualified resident with standing and cause may submit for dissolution if the organization has failed to meet compliance requirements for over a year. You failed to renew your charter. You held no official votes. You didn't even file taxes for the last 2 years. Karen collapsed back into her chair like the wind had been knocked out of her. It got worse. The judge continued reading through the documentation I'd submitted. "Furthermore, given the unlawful operation of the HOA, I am dismissing this lawsuit with prejudice and recommending an audit be opened into the Cedar Hills Lakeside HOA's financial practices." Karen's mouth dropped open. Ruckner stood up, face pale. "Your Honor, we request time to appeal." "You're welcome to file one," the judge said, "but I doubt it will hold." And just like that, it was over. As I left the courthouse, reporters from the local papers stood outside, having caught wind of the legal battle. One of them asked, "Why go so far to fight an HOA?" I gave them a calm smile. "Because freedom doesn't stop at your fence line." Back home, I pulled into my driveway and stepped out into the sunshine. The air felt cleaner, lighter, more letters taped to my mailbox. No more fake violations. The HOA was gone completely and legally dissolved. The next few weeks were surreal. Karen avoided me entirely. Her smug confidence had crumbled into cold silence. Rumors swirled that some residents were filing a class action suit against her for misusing their dues. Her house went up for sale 2 months later, and she left without so much as a goodbye. Meanwhile, the neighborhood changed for the better. People started talking again. Front lawns no longer looked like plastic showroom displays, but actual lived-in homes. One neighbor even set up a Saturday morning coffee stand on his porch and invited everyone over. It felt like a community again, not a compound. A month after everything settled, I got a letter. This time it wasn't from an HOA, it was handwritten, no envelope. Just a note tucked under a mason jar of homemade pickles. It read, "Thanks for standing up for all of us. You reminded us that we're neighbors, not hostages." I smiled. That little jar sat on my kitchen shelf for a long time, an everyday reminder that sometimes doing the right thing means walking into the fire, and sometimes you walk out stronger, freer, and with your entire neighborhood behind you. And Karen, last I heard, she tried to start a new HOA 2 towns over. This time people did their homework, and let's just say, it didn't last long. Enjoyed this true justice takedown? Then don't miss what's coming next on Bright Reality. Like, share, comment, and subscribe for more bold stories that expose power and reveal truth.